The United States Navy had a problem. A very serious, very expensive, and very embarrassing problem. They had spent over $20 billion building a class of warships that, when it came to actually fighting and destroying enemy vessels at sea, were essentially unarmed. Think about that for a moment. $20 billion, warships, no real anti-ship weapons. That is where our story begins, and what follows is one of the most fascinating, controversial, and ultimately redemptive chapters in modern American naval history. This is the story of the naval strike missile, the Littoral combat ship, and the desperate race to turn a billion-dollar liability into a genuine weapon of war. To understand why this matters, you have to go back further than 2019. You have to go back to the dreams, the ambitions, and frankly the delusions of the early 2000s, when Pentagon planners were riding high on the apparent triumph of American military technology. The Cold War was over. The Soviet Navy, that massive blue water threat that had defined American naval strategy for decades, was rusting in ports across the former Soviet Union. American naval dominance seemed absolute, permanent, and unchallengeable. In that environment, the Navy began to think differently about what its future warships needed to do. The vision that emerged was elegant in its concept, if ultimately flawed in its execution. Instead of building large, heavily armed vessels designed to slug it out with peer adversaries on the open ocean, the Navy wanted something fast, something agile, something that could operate close to shore in the shallow coastal waters known as the littoral zone. These future ships would be smaller, cheaper, and they would be modular, meaning you could swap out different mission packages depending on what you needed. Mine countermeasures 1 week, submarine hunting the next, surface warfare the week after that. It was flexible, it was forward-thinking, and it made a certain kind of sense in a world where the primary naval threats seemed to be small boats, pirates, and coastal mines rather than Soviet cruisers. The result of this thinking was the Littoral combat ship program, and when the first of these vessels slid into the water, they genuinely were impressive in certain respects. The Freedom class, built by Lockheed Martin, looked like something out of a science fiction film, with its sleek monohull design and a top speed that left most warships standing still in its wake. The Independence class, built by General Dynamics, was even more visually striking, a dramatic trimaran design with a wide beam and a vast flight deck that looked less like a traditional warship and more like a futuristic ocean platform. Both variants could hit speeds of over 40 knots, making them among the fastest large warships ever built for the United States Navy. They were genuinely revolutionary in their appearance and their speed capabilities. But speed and good looks are not enough when someone is trying to sink you. And here is where the Littoral combat ship story takes its darkest turn. When critics and analysts started looking closely at what these ships could actually do in a real naval battle, the picture was deeply troubling. The primary surface warfare package that was supposed to give these ships their teeth consisted of a 57mm gun and a pair of 30mm guns. Now those weapons are perfectly adequate for dealing with small boats and coastal threats, but against a modern warship, against a missile-armed corvette or frigate, they were essentially useless. The Littoral combat ship, in its original configuration, had no over-the-horizon anti-ship missile capability whatsoever. None. Zero. A peer adversary with even a modestly capable missile-armed vessel could theoretically sit well beyond visual range and simply obliterate an LCS without the American ship ever being able to effectively fight back. The criticism was fierce, and it came from every direction. Congressional oversight committees questioned why the Navy was buying warships that couldn't fight other warships. Former naval officers went on record expressing deep concern about sending these vessels into a contested environment. Defense analysts published papers and reports cataloging the capability gaps in language that ranged from diplomatic concern to outright alarm. The Navy found itself in the deeply uncomfortable position of defending ships that cost hundreds of millions of dollars each, but whose combat survivability against a real naval threat was genuinely questionable. And the timing could not have been worse. Because even as the Littoral combat ships were rolling off the production lines in the mid-2010s, the strategic environment that had seemed so benign in the early 2000s was changing with alarming speed. China was building warships at a rate not seen since World War II. Chinese naval vessels were getting more capable, more numerous, and more aggressive in their operations across the South China Sea and beyond. Russia, despite its post-Cold War decline, was modernizing its naval forces and equipping them with sophisticated anti-ship missiles. The comfortable American naval dominance that had seemed so permanent was suddenly looking a lot less permanent. And in that environment, having a class of warships that couldn't effectively fight other warships was not just embarrassing. It was a genuine strategic liability. The Navy had to do something. The question was what? And the answer, when it came, involved a Norwegian missile that had been quietly proving itself as one of the most capable anti-ship weapons in the world. The Kongsberg Naval Strike Missile has a history that predates its American deployment by quite some time. Kongsberg Gruppen, the Norwegian defense company that developed the weapon, had been working on advanced anti-ship missile technology since the 1990s, building on Norway's long experience with coastal defense and naval warfare in the complex fjord environments of the Norwegian coastline. The result of that work was a missile that, when it entered service with the Royal Norwegian Navy in 2012, represented a genuine leap forward in anti-ship capability. What made the Naval Strike Missile special was not just its range, though that was impressive. It was the combination of capabilities that made it genuinely formidable. The missile had a range of approximately 100 nautical miles, putting it firmly in the over-the-horizon category. But range alone doesn't win battles. What made the Naval Strike Missile particularly dangerous was its guidance system. The missile used a combination of GPS navigation, an inertial navigation system, and critically, an infrared seeker with an onboard target library. This meant that the missile could be programmed to approach its target from specific directions, fly low to avoid radar detection, and then in the terminal phase of its flight, use its infrared seeker to identify and lock onto the specific ship it was targeting, even in environments with multiple vessels present. It could tell the difference between a container ship and a warship. It could pick the right target in a crowded harbor. That was a genuinely sophisticated capability that most anti-ship missiles of its era could not match. The missile was also designed with survivability in mind. It could fly sea-skimming trajectories that kept it close to the water surface for most of its flight, dramatically reducing the window of time that enemy radar systems had to detect it and respond. It could execute evasive maneuvers in the terminal phase to complicate the job of close-in weapon systems trying to shoot it down. And it was compact enough to be launched from relatively small platforms, which was exactly what the Navy needed for the Littoral combat ship. Kongsberg had not developed this weapon in isolation from the American market. They had partnered with Raytheon, one of the largest and most experienced American defense contractors, to bring the Naval Strike Missile to the United States. Raytheon brought its own formidable expertise in missile systems and its deep relationships with the American military establishment. Together, the two companies offered a weapon that was not only technically impressive, but also came with the kind of industrial and logistical support infrastructure that the American military required. This partnership would prove essential to getting the Naval Strike Missile onto American ships. The decision to pursue the Naval Strike Missile for the Littoral combat ship emerged from a recognition that waiting for some future perfect solution was no longer acceptable. The Navy had been pursuing various concepts for improving the surface warfare capabilities of its LCS fleet for years, and those efforts had not produced results fast enough. The over-the-horizon surface warfare requirement had become urgent. China's naval expansion was not pausing while the Pentagon worked through its procurement processes. Something had to happen, and it had to happen relatively quickly by the standards of American defense acquisition. The initial demonstration that set things in motion came in 2014, when the Navy tested the Naval Strike Missile from a fixed land-based launcher and demonstrated its ability to hit a moving ship target. The test was successful, and it showed that the fundamental technology worked. But getting from a successful test to an integrated shipboard system was a long and complex journey involving engineering challenges, procurement processes, testing requirements, and the inevitable political dimensions of a high-profile defense program. By 2019, that journey had progressed to a critical milestone. The Navy was ready to conduct its first live-fire test of the Naval strike missile from an actual littoral combat ship. The ship selected for this historic test was the USS Gabrielle Giffords, an Independence-class littoral combat ship that had been equipped with a prototype naval strike missile launcher. The test was conducted in the Pacific, and when the missile left the launcher, flew its programmed trajectory, and successfully struck its target vessel, it marked the beginning of a new chapter not just for the littoral combat ship program, but for American surface warfare capability. The reaction to that successful 2019 test was significant. Navy officials spoke about it in terms that made clear they understood its importance. This was not just a weapons test. It was a validation of a strategy for rescuing the littoral combat ship program from its critics and demonstrating that these ships could, in fact, be given real offensive punch. The test generated genuine excitement within the surface warfare community, where officers had watched the capability gap issue with increasing frustration for years. Here, finally, was a path forward. But excitement is one thing. Actual integration is another. And the process of actually getting the naval strike missile properly integrated into the littoral combat ship fleet over the following years was a complex, expensive, and at times frustrating endeavor that revealed much about the challenges of modern naval procurement. The first challenge was purely physical. The naval strike missile launcher that was installed on the USS Gabrielle Giffords for the initial test was a prototype installation. Turning that prototype into a production-ready system that could be installed on multiple ships required engineering work, testing, and refinement. The launcher itself had to be integrated with the ship's combat management system, which meant software work as well as hardware work. The fire control systems had to be adapted to handle the missile's targeting requirements. Crew training programs had to be developed. Maintenance and logistics pipelines had to be established. None of this happened overnight. The Independence-class ships, with their wide trimaran hulls, actually provided more deck space for systems like the Naval strike missile launcher than the narrower Freedom-class vessels. This physical characteristic meant that the early focus of NSM integration tended to concentrate on the Independence class. The trimaran design that had struck many observers as exotic and perhaps unnecessarily novel when the ships were first designed, turned out to have practical advantages when it came to fitting additional weapons systems. Throughout 2019 and into 2020, the Navy continued testing and refining the naval strike missile integration. Additional test firings were conducted, each one generating data that fed back into the integration process. Engineers worked through the interface between the missile system and the ship's combat management suite. Procedures were developed for how crews would operate the system in realistic tactical scenarios. The unglamorous but essential work of turning a successful test into a deployable operational capability was grinding forward. Then came 2020. And with it, a set of challenges that nobody in the procurement community had anticipated, because nobody had anticipated a global pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted defense programs across the board, and the naval strike missile integration effort was not immune. Shipyard work was affected as facilities implemented safety protocols and dealt with workforce disruptions. Testing schedules were delayed as travel restrictions complicated the logistics of bringing together the engineers, technicians, and military personnel needed to conduct complex weapons tests. Supply chain issues that would become a persistent feature of the post-pandemic economy began to emerge, affecting components needed for the program. Despite these challenges, the program kept moving. The Navy made clear that the naval strike missile integration was a priority, and priorities tend to find ways to overcome obstacles even in difficult circumstances. The fundamental urgency had not changed. The strategic environment, if anything, had become more pressing rather than less, as China continued its naval buildup and rhetoric in the Pacific became increasingly pointed. The year 2021 brought renewed momentum to the program. The USS Coronado, another Independence-class littoral combat ship, conducted naval strike missile exercises that demonstrated growing proficiency with the weapons system. The Navy was not just testing the hardware anymore. It was testing tactics, training crews, and developing the operational concepts that would govern how the naval strike missile would actually be used in a real-world scenario. This was the maturation of the program from an engineering challenge to an operational one, and it was a crucial transition. Naval tacticians working with the naval strike missile were thinking carefully about how to integrate its capabilities into broader surface warfare concepts. A single littoral combat ship armed with naval strike missiles was a more capable vessel than it had ever been before. But naval warfare is rarely about single ships. It is about how multiple vessels work together, how they share targeting data, how they coordinate their fires to overwhelm an adversary's defenses. The naval strike missile needed to be woven into the fabric of how the Navy operated its surface forces, not just bolted onto a ship and left to fend for itself tactically. One of the key conceptual developments that influenced how the Navy thought about NSM on the LCS was the broader strategic shift toward distributed maritime operations. This concept, which the Navy was developing in direct response to the Chinese naval threat, envisioned American surface forces operating in smaller, more dispersed units spread across a wide area rather than concentrated in traditional carrier strike group formations. In this operational concept, the littoral combat ship, with its speed and relatively small size, could be a valuable asset if it had the weapons to actually threaten enemy surface forces. The naval strike missile was precisely what gave the LCS a meaningful role in distributed maritime operations. The missile's range meant that an LCS armed with naval strike missiles could participate in coordinated attacks on enemy surface forces from distances that kept the ship relatively safe from many shorter-range threats. Multiple LCS vessels, operating in coordination with each other and with other naval assets, could generate a volume of fire that would seriously complicate an adversary's defensive calculus. The picture of the littoral combat ship had changed fundamentally. From a vessel that critics had derided as a target waiting to be hit, it was evolving into a genuine contributor to American surface warfare power. By 2022, the naval strike missile integration had progressed to the point where the Navy was making formal programmatic decisions about fleet-wide implementation. The question was no longer whether to put the naval strike missile on littoral combat ships, but how many ships would get it, and on what timeline. The Navy announced plans to equip multiple LCS vessels with the system, representing a commitment that went well beyond the initial testing and experimentation phase. This commitment was significant for several reasons beyond just the obvious one of increasing the combat power of the LCS fleet. It represented a validation of the entire approach. Critics of the littoral combat ship had argued for years that the ships were fundamentally flawed, that the modular mission package concept had failed, and that the Navy should stop building them and start over with something more capable. The naval strike missile integration was, in part, a counterargument to that position. It showed that the Navy could add meaningful capability to existing ships, that the LCS platform, whatever its other shortcomings, could be armed properly. That said, the program was not without its complications and controversies during this period. The cost of the naval strike missile integration was a subject of ongoing discussion. Each launcher installation and associated equipment represented a significant investment, and with the LCS program already under criticism for cost overruns and capability issues, every additional expenditure was scrutinized carefully. Defense analysts debated whether the money being spent on NSM integration for the LCS might be better invested elsewhere, perhaps in the new frigates that were beginning to enter the procurement pipeline. The USS Constellation frigate program, which was proceeding in parallel, was designed from the outset to carry the Naval Strike Missile as part of its standard armament. This raised pointed questions about the logic of spending money to retrofit the weapon onto littoral combat ships when the new frigates would have it as a built-in capability. The Navy's answer was that the frigate program would take years to deliver hulls in meaningful numbers, and in the meantime, the existing LCS fleet needed better weapons. The logic was defensible, but it was symptomatic of the kind of procurement dilemmas that arise when ambitious modernization plans run up against the reality of time and budget constraints. Throughout 2022, additional naval strike missile tests and exercises continued to build the evidence base for the weapon's effectiveness and the growing proficiency of crews operating it. The Navy was also working on ensuring that the targeting architecture for the NSM was robust and connected to the broader naval network. A missile with a range of 100 nautical miles is most effective when it can receive targeting data from multiple sources, not just the sensors on its own ship. Integrating the Naval Strike Missile into the Navy's broader targeting network, connecting it to data from aircraft, satellites, and other ships, was a critical enabling work that was proceeding in parallel with the physical integration of the launchers. The cooperative engagement capabilities that would allow multiple ships to share targeting data and coordinate their naval strike missile fires were essential to making the weapon truly effective in a distributed maritime operations context. A single ship's sensors can only see so far and cover so much ocean. But if that ship's naval strike missiles can be targeted based on data from a maritime patrol aircraft operating 100 miles away, or from a submarine's acoustic detections, or from satellite imagery, the effective reach of the weapon multiplies dramatically. Building and testing these connections was painstaking work, but it was work that transformed the Naval Strike Missile from a standalone weapon into a node in a networked strike system. Into 2023, the program reached what might fairly be described as a mature operational phase. Ships with naval strike missile capability were deploying with the system as a fully integrated part of their armament rather than as an experimental addition. Crews who had trained on the weapon were going to sea with it, conducting exercises that incorporated it into realistic tactical scenarios, and developing the kind of practical expertise that only comes from sustained engagement with a system over time. The deployment of NSM-equipped littoral combat ships to the Pacific theater was particularly significant given the strategic context. The waters of the Western Pacific, including the South China Sea and the approaches to Taiwan, had become the defining strategic concern of American naval planning. The presence of American surface combatants with genuine over-the-horizon anti-ship capability in those waters sent a message that was not lost on Chinese naval planners. The littoral combat ship had been, in its earlier configuration, a vessel that Chinese anti-ship missile batteries could effectively ignore in their targeting calculations, because it posed no credible threat to their own surface forces at the ranges that mattered. An LCS armed with naval strike missiles was a different proposition. Chinese naval doctrine, which had invested heavily in anti-access and area denial capabilities designed to keep American forces at a distance, had to grapple with a more complex picture. Multiple small, fast, hard-to-track American warships, each capable of launching precision anti-ship missiles from over-the-horizon ranges, complicated the targeting problem for Chinese surface forces in ways that the original, unarmed LCS never had. The strategic mathematics had shifted, even if modestly. The exercise record of the Naval Strike Missile on LCS platforms through 2023 was impressive. Multiple successful test firings under realistic conditions demonstrated that the weapon worked as advertised, and that American crews could operate it effectively. The targeting systems, the launch procedures, the maintenance requirements, the crew training pipelines, all of these had matured to the point where the Naval Strike Missile was not an experimental addition to the LCS, but a genuine operational capability that could be counted on in a real-world scenario. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the broader significance of what the Naval Strike Missile brought to the Littoral combat ship, because it was more than just a weapons capability. It was a restoration of credibility. The LCS program had been one of the most controversial and publicly criticized procurement efforts in recent American military history. The ships had been derided in Congress, mocked in the defense press, and questioned by serving officers in ways that were unusual in their frankness. The Naval Strike Missile integration did not solve every problem the program had faced. The questions about survivability against sophisticated adversaries, about the mission package concept, about the ship's ability to operate in high-threat environments, those questions did not all disappear with the addition of an anti-ship missile. But the NSM integration gave the LCS fleet a capability that was unambiguously real, unambiguously valuable, and unambiguously important to the Navy's ability to execute its missions in the Pacific. The Kongsberg-Raytheon partnership that produced the Naval Strike Missile also deserves attention in the context of this story, because it represents something interesting about how modern defense programs actually work. The idea that major military systems are developed entirely within one country is increasingly a fiction. The most capable weapons often emerge from international partnerships that combine different nations' technical expertise, industrial capabilities, and operational experience. Norway had developed genuine expertise in anti-ship warfare born of its unique geographic situation and strategic requirements. That expertise, embodied in the Naval Strike Missile, was exactly what the American Navy needed. The willingness to look beyond American borders for the solution to an American naval problem was a practical acknowledgement of where the best available technology actually resided. This international dimension of the program also had implications for alliance relationships. The Naval Strike Missile's success in American service reinforced the defense technology relationship between the United States and Norway, a NATO ally of considerable strategic importance given its geographic position relative to Russia's northern naval forces. When American ships demonstrate the effectiveness of a Norwegian-developed weapon, it strengthens the technology-sharing relationships that underpin the alliance. Other NATO allies took note of the NSM's performance in American service, and interest in the weapon spread across the alliance, contributing to a broader standardization of surface warfare capabilities that has its own strategic value. The industrial implications of the NSM program were also significant. Raytheon's involvement ensured that American manufacturing contributed meaningfully to the production of the missiles that American ships were firing. Production facilities in the United States manufacturing components and eventually complete missiles for the American market meant jobs, industrial capacity, and the kind of domestic production base that strategic planners consider essential for sustaining a major conflict. Dependence on foreign production for critical weapons systems is a strategic vulnerability. The Raytheon partnership addressed that vulnerability while preserving the technical excellence of the Norwegian-developed missile design. Through the 2019 to 2023 period, the Naval Strike Missile also benefited from the broader competitive dynamics of the anti-ship missile market. The weapon was not standing still technologically. Kongsberg continued to develop and refine the Naval Strike Missile family, and the lessons learned from American testing and operational experience fed back into that development process. The operational feedback loop between the Navy's experience with the weapon and Kongsberg's development efforts was a genuine advantage of having a close working relationship between the missile's developer and its most prominent new operator. The period also saw important developments in the targeting and networking dimension of the NSM capability. The Navy was working to integrate the naval strike missile with its broader kill chain infrastructure, the network of sensors, communication systems, and command and control processes that determine how targeting data flows from detection to engagement. This was not simple work. It involved software development, communication systems integration, doctrine development, and training, all of which had to come together in a coherent package before the theoretical capability of the weapon could be realized operationally. One of the most interesting tactical questions that naval planners wrestled with during this period was how to use the naval strike missile's sophisticated target discrimination capability in complex environments. The missile's infrared seeker and target library gave it an unusual ability to identify and select specific ships in a multi-vessel environment. This capability had obvious value in scenarios where civilian shipping was present in the same waters as military targets. The ability to engage a specific warship while avoiding civilian vessels nearby was not just tactically useful but legally and politically significant in the context of the laws of armed conflict. Planning for how to use this capability responsibly and effectively was part of the broader operational development work that proceeded alongside the technical integration effort. The Littoral combat ship program itself was undergoing significant evolution during the 2019 to 2023 period beyond just the naval strike missile integration. The Navy was making difficult decisions about the overall size of the program and the future of the mission package concept. The original vision of fully interchangeable mission packages had proven more difficult and expensive to realize than anticipated, and the practical reality of how the ships operated had diverged somewhat from the programmatic vision. Some mission packages had performed better than others. The surface warfare package, even with the addition of the naval strike missile, remained a subject of ongoing development and refinement. The Navy was also grappling with questions about the long-term future of the LCS fleet in the context of evolving force structure plans. The frigate program, the return to a proven concept of a medium-sized warship with substantial built-in capability rather than the modular approach of the LCS, was being accelerated. This raised questions about how long the LCS fleet would remain in service and whether the investments being made in its capability improvements, including the NSM integration, would deliver their intended value over the ship's service lives. These were important programmatic questions, but they should not obscure what was actually happening operationally. Whatever the debates about force structure and procurement strategy, the ships that were actually in the water and actually equipped with naval strike missiles were genuinely more capable than their predecessors had been. Officers commanding those ships had tools available to them that earlier LCS commanding officers could only have wished for. The sailors operating those systems were developing expertise that would carry forward regardless of what happened to the program in the long run. The human dimension of the naval strike missile integration story is worth dwelling on, because programs like this are ultimately executed by people. The sailors and officers who trained on the naval strike missile, who worked through the procedures for operating it, who fired it in tests and exercises, who figured out how to maintain it and what to do when things went wrong with it. Those individuals were the real implementers of this capability upgrade. Their professionalism and dedication to mastering a complex new weapons system made the difference between a capability that existed on paper and a capability that could actually be counted on in a real engagement. The culture of the Littoral combat ship community during this period was one of resilience under criticism. These sailors knew their ships had been disparaged publicly. They knew the program was controversial. And they responded to that criticism not with defensiveness, but with determination to make their ships as capable as possible. The naval strike missile integration was embraced within the LCS community not just as a programmatic decision from above, but as a genuine opportunity to demonstrate that their ships had value. That attitude contributed meaningfully to the speed and effectiveness with which the integration was accomplished. As 2023 progressed and the program moved further into its operational maturity phase, it was possible to step back and assess what had actually been accomplished since that first successful test firing in 2019. The Littoral combat ship fleet, or at least a meaningful portion of it, had gone from having essentially no over-the-horizon anti-ship capability to being equipped with one of the most sophisticated sea-skimming anti-ship missiles available in the world. The capability gap that had been such a source of criticism and concern had been substantially addressed. That was a real achievement, accomplished in a compressed time frame, against a backdrop of pandemic disruption and ongoing programmatic turbulence. The naval strike missile integration on the Littoral combat ship was also becoming a model for how the Navy could rapidly add capability to existing platforms when urgency demanded it. The traditional American defense procurement process is often criticized for its slowness, its bureaucratic complexity, and its tendency to let perfect be the enemy of good. The NSM integration, whatever its imperfections, showed that when there was sufficient urgency and sufficient will, the system could move with reasonable speed. Ships that had been criticized as toothless had been given real teeth in a matter of years rather than decades. That was a lesson worth learning. Looking at the broader strategic context of 2023, the importance of what had been accomplished was thrown into sharp relief by developments that had accelerated since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. That conflict had provided real-world demonstrations of the importance of anti-ship missile capability that were impossible to ignore. The sinking of the Russian guided missile cruiser Moskva by Ukrainian Neptune anti-ship missiles in April 2022 had sent shockwaves through naval establishments around the world. It demonstrated in the most visceral possible terms that anti-ship missiles work, that even sophisticated warships are vulnerable to well-employed anti-ship weapons, and that the investment in over-the-horizon strike capability was not theoretical but operationally decisive. The lessons of the Moskva's sinking resonated directly with the naval strike missile integration story. If the Ukrainians, with a much smaller and less well-resourced military establishment, could use domestically developed anti-ship missiles to sink a major Russian warship, the implications for how the United States Navy equipped its vessels with anti-ship capability were obvious. The argument that the Littoral combat ship needed over-the-horizon anti-ship missiles had always been intellectually sound. After the Moskva, it was also emotionally and politically compelling in a way that made investment in the naval strike missile integration even easier to justify. By the end of 2023, the naval strike missile on the Littoral combat ship had evolved from a promising experiment to an established operational capability. The ships carrying it were genuinely different combat assets than they had been in 2018. The Navy had a surface warfare tool that it had not had before. The Pacific Fleet, in particular, was better equipped to contribute to the distributed maritime operations that were the conceptual cornerstone of American strategy for a potential conflict with China. None of this meant that all the questions about the Littoral combat ship program had been answered or that all the critics had been silenced. But it meant that the critique that these ships were fundamentally unarmed and thus fundamentally useless was no longer valid. The story of the naval strike missile on the Littoral combat ship is, at its heart, a story about adaptation. It is a story about a naval force recognizing a serious deficiency, identifying an available solution, and executing the integration of that solution under difficult circumstances. It is a story about Norwegian engineering excellence, American industrial capacity, and the partnership between allies that makes each stronger. It is a story about the sailors and officers who took a controversial, criticized platform and worked to make it the best it could be. And it is a story about the urgency that drives military capability development when the strategic environment demands it. The world of 2023 was not the world of 2001, when the Littoral combat ship concept was born. The threats had changed, the adversaries had grown more capable, and the requirement for American surface combatants to be able to engage enemy ships at over-the-horizon ranges had become not a theoretical future requirement but an immediate operational necessity. The naval strike missile integration on the Littoral combat ship was the Navy's answer to that necessity. It was imperfect, as all real-world solutions to complex problems are imperfect. But it was real, it was effective, and it represented a meaningful contribution to American naval power at a moment when that power was being tested and challenged in new and serious ways. The history of naval warfare is full of examples of weapon systems that arrived too late, cost too much, and delivered too little. The naval strike missile integration on the Littoral combat ship is something different. It arrived when it was needed, it cost what it cost, and it delivered a capability that was genuinely important. That, in the often frustrating world of defense procurement, is worth recognizing and understanding. The ships that were once called floating targets had become, with the addition of a Norwegian-designed, American-integrated anti-ship missile, something considerably more dangerous. And in a world where the competition for naval supremacy was intensifying by the year, that transformation was not just a procurement footnote. It was a chapter in the ongoing story of how America maintains its power at sea. The naval strike missile story on the Littoral combat ship did not end in 2023. It continued, as such stories always do, into the next phase of development, the next round of procurement decisions, the next generation of tactical concepts, and the next set of strategic challenges. But the period from 2019 to 2023 was where the critical work happened, where the foundation was laid, where the skeptics were proved wrong enough to matter. That is the period that history will remember as the moment when the Littoral combat ship found its teeth. And it found them not in some laboratory or on some drawing board, but in the open ocean, in the spray and the wind, when a Norwegian missile left an American ship and struck its target with precision that left no room for doubt. Now you know the full story. You know how a program that was derided as a failure found a second act. You know how an alliance partnership produced a weapon that changed the combat calculus of an entire class of warships. You know how sailors and engineers, working against a backdrop of geopolitical urgency, turned a concept into an operational reality. And you know why this matters not just as history, but as a living lesson in how navies adapt, evolve, and find ways to meet the challenges of a changing world. So here is the question I want to leave you with today. Given everything you now know about how the Littoral combat ship was transformed by the naval strike missile integration, and given the ongoing debates about the future of the LCS program, about the new frigates, about distributed maritime operations, and about the growing naval challenge from China, do you think the Navy made the right call by investing in upgrading the LCS with NSM capability? Or would that money have been better spent accelerating the next generation of warships? Think about it. The answer is not as simple as it might seem. If this story gave you something to think about, if the history of ships and weapons and strategy and the people who navigate all three resonated with you, then subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that notification bell so you are always the first to know when new content drops. And share this video with someone who loves military history, naval history, or just the kind of deep dive storytelling that takes you somewhere you have never been before. This is the kind of history that matters, and the more people who understand it, the better.